Hello, everybody, and welcome to the session on family offices and innovation. It's a very, very broad subject, and I'm lucky enough to have members of a family office, and also some very distinguished people who run family offices, provide strategy into family offices, and hopefully we'll have a discussion on the future, the problems we face, and how we can evolve. My name's Simon Fentham-Fletcher. I'm the CIO of Freedom Asset Management. We are a boutique asset manager and multifamily office based here in ADGM and also in Guernsey. What I'd like to do is actually have the panel introduce themselves, describe their involvement in family offices, and also what they think a family office is, which I think is really important, because the spectrum is so vast. So, should we start with Ruchi Dana?
Yeah, sure.
And perhaps you can tell us a bit about yourself and how you see your role in a family office.
Sure. So hi, I'm Dr. Ruchi Dana. I'm a medical doctor, and then I also did my MBA from Stanford. So after coming back from Stanford, that's typically how the second generation works. You need to constantly change your entire family business. So we decided to have a family office. Initially, it was just the CFO who was taking care of things.
Sure.
And we realized that was not a very efficient use of his time, because he couldn't do other things. And a family office comprises not just of investing, but there's also philanthropy, corporate governance, structuring, reporting. So these are all components that we finally found weren't required in our family office, and that's when we established the family office. Our core business is steel, oil. We're also into retail. We have some hospitals and hotels back in India, and we have a lot of commercial mixed-use real estate. So that's our core business, but the family office is doing mainly investing activities, and then it's also taking care of corporate governance, structuring, reporting, and philanthropy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruchi. If we move along, we actually have somebody that you probably recognize from CNBC quite a bit, Carole Pepper. Carole, if you could just tell us a bit, obviously we know a little bit about you, but a little bit how your role has evolved and how you see a family office.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here. It's my first time in Abu Dhabi. What a beautiful country. What a wonderful, warm welcome we've all had here, and it's just been an incredible experience. I feel so honored to be here. I act as a consultant, and for the last 18 years, I have set up single-family offices all over the world, including in this region of the world. I also improve existing single-family offices to help them get ready for transferring to the next generation. And I act as the external chief investment officer to several large single-family offices with a great focus on impact investing and direct private investing, and actually treating the family operating businesses as investments. And if you were to say to me, what is a family office? I think a family office is the nexus of the control of all the wealth and the transfer, most importantly, of wealth from one generation to the next. There's a saying all over the world that the first generation makes money, the second generation spends money, and the third generation goes back to work. And in order for that not to happen, there are very specific protocols that you can put into place so that your family will become a long-lived, multi-generational family. I was very honored because I managed over $1 billion at the Rockefeller family office before I started my business. That family is now in their 8th generation. They still have their wealth. They're doing incredible social impact all over the world. And the practices that they have put into place make this happen. It's not an accident. And in addition, there are wonderful studies that have been done by the Wharton School of Business, which you can receive online. You just Google it, Wharton Family Office Studies, which show across the entire globe, families that have good governance practices, procedures, and a strategic way to approach managing their family actually make more money, and those families have the successful transfer between one generation to the next.
Thanks. Moving along, we have Simon Tandy. One of the great things about this panel is actually we're rather outnumbered. It's 60% ladies and 40% men. So, Simon, another Simon. Simon, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. I run a single-family office in Dubai. I'm a CIO by training. I spend most of my time as an asset allocator. I think the only other thing I'd add from what's already been said, what is the most important part of your job? Yes, getting the asset allocation correct, but the actual real piece, I often think is often overlooked, is actually the relationship with the family. And if that doesn't work or goes wrong, well, you're clearly out of a job. But actually just managing the expectations for the family, something like this year, and Carole may well have achieved 25% return on her clients, but I certainly haven't. But just managing the expectations of what the family think is achievable, as well as possibly telling them from time to time that their income requirements may be unrealistic.
Thank you. Roxanne.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you. So just to add to that, my background is I've been working with families for almost 3 decades, and I have set up the office of the Spinola family in Singapore about 8 years ago. This is a family that goes back 900 years. And in fact has been linked to having a apprentice called Christopher Columbus, and the sort of venture capital side of our portfolio like to put the United States as one of our first investments. But the point of the matter is that for this family, they are guardians of wealth. And so the real focus of the family office is sort of preservation, growth, and purpose of capital. And we as the officers and the partners inside the family office are tasked to innovate within those different areas to the extent that our mandate allows. So we make direct investments. We also invest in funds. And we are really a feedback loop from the market into the family to make larger strategic decisions or thematic decisions.
Yeah, Roxanne, you bring a really interesting point. I mean, your family's been going for 900 years. You do reinvent yourself and innovate is in the title of the panel piece. But at the same time, we sometimes wonder how actually we do innovate. And it's interesting, over 900 years, obviously, massive innovation has happened in the financial world. But I'm really interested, not in how we think we innovate, but how a member of a family office, the family, how they perceive innovation is it part of their mandate? What's the mandate of your family? And how do you strive to push things forward?
Sure. So one good thing about these days is that technology has come to an extent that there's no, the growth is not incremental, it's exponential, right?
Yeah.
And we are in a very traditional business, that's steel and oil. So there's not much disruption happening, but we are constantly afraid of what could come next. So our business is like a huge Titanic, which is going in a certain way, but we don't know what would happen. So that's why we want to be aware about the new innovations that are happening in our industry and otherwise. So what we have specifically for innovation, we look at startups.
Okay.
So every year we go out mainly to the Silicon Valley and also the MENA region. We go to demo days and see, we have tie-ups with a few funds to see what are the new innovations that are happening, not just in our space, but in other spaces as well. For example, we also look at medtech. That's because that's something that we understand as a family, because there are a lot of doctors in the family. So we try to have an eye on whatever is disrupting our industry, and also to diversify, we are looking at medtech, healthcare, because that's something that we understand. But these are the only 2 industries that we are focusing on, because we don't want to go into areas that we really don't understand, like crypto or cannabis.
Do you work very closely? Obviously, we've got CIOs and strategists, and people are very involved in making sure that the family pot is full and hopefully overfloweth, so that the mandate that you have as a family, how closely do you work with the CIO that you have?
Yeah, so the CIO clearly knows that he has to bring at least 10 startups to the board meeting. 10. So that's our internal demo day that we have.
Every quarter or every?
Every quarter.
Okay.
So he goes and he sees various startups, but at the board meeting there should be 10 startups, at least the ideas, and then we'll see which startups are really innovative, and that's how we decide, because we have to be if we have a demo day annually, then this technology is evolving at a very fast rate, so that doesn't make sense. So that's one of the mandates for the CIO. He has to bring startups, because maybe it's just because that we were educated in the US, mainly in the Bay Area, so we understand that, and we understand that innovation is coming from that region. But otherwise, like, the traditional investments are going on fine, but the certain mandate that we have nowadays is to look at startups.
Okay, so public markets and very much VC and private equity. Let me ask Roxanne, how much is private and VC orientated becoming part of your portfolios? And is it because it's something I think that globally it becomes there's a creep to more to the private markets because it's not as volatile, right, in pricing.
Okay, so I know where you're coming with that, and I would say that the families, and it depends on the, really depends on the archetype of the family, but the institutional investor, the pension funds, endowments, they're more concerned about low volatility, smoothing of returns. I have heard some family office officers say, you know what, I don't want to lose my job, the fear of losing money. They want to invest in things that have these smooth out returns, and they don't really understand the risk that they're running, and that's actually very wrong inside of a family office. I think venture and private has been the DNA of family offices, because without, the proper allocation of capital per se, the efficient allocation to capital, you're never going to create wealth or preserve it. So it's investing in those areas has, been since the beginning of the time for families, whether it's individuals or in a context of a professionally managed family office. It all comes down to the same thing as far as I'm concerned. So we innovate within how we look at risk and how we look at a variety of different things. We have to constantly be on top of a changing market. That's a key component to long-term value creation, but we also, our families, because of the purpose of their capital, the way that they view their role, then they may invest with incubators in biotech, or for renewables, investing in what was crazy ideas like nuclear fusion or anything that's, when they invested an idea that didn't have the technology to back the vision, but that today is now feasible.
Yeah, I guess our families they make their money in the real world, in real industries. Guys like us from the finance world are trying to move them sometimes almost too far away from the things that they feel comfortable with. Carole, do you find that there has been an increasing allocation into the private side of the world?
Absolutely. I would say 10 years ago, the buzz was around hedge funds. Everybody thought that's where you could make alpha. And then, once the internet happened, frankly, alpha went out of the public markets, and they all became beta, essentially. So now people realize the way to really make money is the old-fashioned way, as Roxanne said, going back to our roots, finding companies we can operate, we can get behind, and scale. So a lot of the families are looking for, let's say, a small company with a fantastic idea that then can be scaled globally. So healthcare solutions, or biotech solutions, or solar energy solutions, things that are going to be needed in the future. Perhaps one little genius somewhere has figured it out, but that person doesn't know how to scale and doesn't have the muscle to bring it around an entire country or a region. And that's another reason why we see family offices getting together globally and doing co-investing. So, for example, we might take a company into Latin America for one of our families, and Ruchi might take it into India, and you might take it into Asia, or you might take it into the Middle East, and we could all take advantage of the fact that we can work together. And there's a lot of disintermediation of the banks nowadays, because family offices, large ones, quite frankly, have very sophisticated staff, and they can do it directly between each other, just like they did in the old days. It's very interesting. In the old days in the United States, Carnegie and Rockefeller and these guys all did deals together. And it's sort of going back to the way it was at the end of the 19th century. And in terms of innovation, I think families are very, very aware that things are changing rapidly in the world. Artificial intelligence, which I know is a big focus here in Abu Dhabi with their center, robotics, different healthcare solutions, alternative energy, water, food, agriculture, all these topics are going to affect our planet very severely over the next 20 to 30 years, are already affecting our planet severely. There's going to be dislocations. If robots have all the jobs, how do you feed people, things like that. And so people are really thinking about, how do I how do I be the one who takes that great idea and gets it going and then scales it or perhaps brings in other families? Because a lot of governments, frankly, are hamstrung. They can't necessarily have the funds and the wherewithal, particularly in the West, to fund a lot of innovation. That's one of the things that's fantastic over here, that the government is very involved in funding innovation, and that's a very positive thing for the region, and I think why this region of the world is going to have more and more leadership going forward.
Sure. I mean, Simon, mandate's important, I guess, the most important thing. I mean, as I said, talking about cup overflows. How does your family view its mandate, and then how does it, obviously that will impact your allocations to different asset classes?
I think it's a very good direct question. And I think the first part of it is possibly sort of educating the family as to their risk profile. We have a big operating business in the UAE, so I should say I set up their family office. There was nobody before me. So in doing the strategy piece, the family very quickly understood the first condition I put down was no GCC or MENA exposure in the family office, because the operating businesses are here. So they got that very quickly. But then at the other end of the scale, we have all the standard asset allocations and all the big names. I think family offices are much more willing, because they have been successful in their operating businesses, hence the creation of the family office, are much more willing to consider investing in startups, and quite often actually not in businesses which they made their own wealth in. And Carole's already mentioned technology and healthcare and education are possibly the three biggest ones. And I think the other point just to highlight, and I think it surprises people who aren't in the family office space or had a career in family offices, family offices do speak to each other. They may not particularly in the Middle East, but in the rest of the world they do. And actually it's the best due diligence. If Carole says she's been with a fund or an opportunity for 5 years and it's done really well and there's now an opportunity to invest in it, half my due diligence is done already. Whereas if I get a cold call with no connections, I've got a lot of homework to do myself. Sure. So families do speak to each other a lot more than I think salesmen realise.
Ruchi, from your side, how often do you address the mandate for your family? How often do you come together and sit down and do planning, looking forward, and deciding how you want to change things? Because that will directly impact all down the line and how these guys are, where they're trying to allocate so that they can make sure that your needs are fulfilled.
Yeah.
So how often does that happen?
So apart from the quarterly board meeting, we have like a biannual thing in which, like, if not all, like most of the family members come together, and there's the CIO who also sits together, and then that's when we design the strategy for the next 6 months. Okay. So that's very important, because at times let's say we were looking just at medtech, but there's a new wave that's coming, and we don't want to lose on that, right? Mm-hmm. So that's something that the CIO's it's his duty to actually inform the family members and the entire board that this is what's happening, and if you want, and if everybody, it's almost like a vote. Like if people agree, then we go for the next industry as well.
I've got a really interesting question, because one of the things, there's been a proliferation of family offices, and one of the things that is slightly frustrating is that often people talk about this being the next hedge fund thing, which is horrible to people that saw the decline of the hedge fund world. Often people have said that the rise of the family office is because of the decline of the private bank, and that the rise of the multifamily office turning into almost mini private banks is something that is a natural evolution. Did you specifically say we're going to have our own single family office because you were not getting the things that you wanted because you were not serviced properly? Or was it what drove the desire to be guiding your own intergenerational wealth?
Sure. So the main reason there was that it was a very, very traditional business, and especially after getting educated at the Western world, me and my brother, we were like, we should do something about it. And steel is required for construction, and construction is only for the developing countries. There would be like a time where not enough steel would be required in the markets, and then our factories wouldn't be running at the full capacity, right? So we had to diversify. That was one of the reasons that we decided to, and our diversification has been into real estate and other sectors, but we decided that we have to get, like, apart from Middle East and Asia, we have to get some exposure in the other countries as well. That's why we decided to enter startups.
Okay. Carole, the death of private banking is the birth of family office. How do you see this?
Well, definitely. I would say that I started working in the family office space in the 90s. But I would say after the crash in 2008, there were a lot of families who felt very betrayed by their private banks that told them to stay in the market, and then everything fell apart and they lost a ton of money, or they put them in very bad loans backed by hedge funds, and then they had trouble with their operating businesses. A lot of bad things happened in that crash, and that really woke up a lot of families to say, wait a minute, our interests are not the same as the bank's interests. Our interests are for our family over multiple generations. The bank's interest is to make money today. And it's not the bank can't be your advisor. The bank is your salesperson. The advisors have to be inside the family office who understand the family's long-term strategic vision. So you need to have a long-term strategic vision for your family, just as you have one for your company. Mm-hmm. So people are now writing family constitutions, family governance, and having a long-term family vision. Ideally, you do that first, and that long-term family vision then drives how you put your operating businesses together, what you do with your liquid assets, what you do with your philanthropy, so everything becomes integrated. And there were just so many parts that the bank can't help people with. The bank can help you with getting loans and your liquid investments, and pretty much that's about it. Everything else, which is 99% of what family offices do, needed to be sort of pulled out of the holding company and put into its own specialized unit. Many of these operations were done by holding companies, or in some families are still being done at the holding company level, but it's very unfair to ask your CFO to take care of your personal money. That's not actually his expertise. It's much better off to put that in a special group, call that your family office. Different, depending on your country, you're going to structure it differently for tax reasons and put it in different places, for example. But by having those people pulled out of holding and over here, and you drive them with your strategy for what they want to do, and you also look at your operating businesses as investments, because really that's what they are. They're not just sentimental things that you own, they're actually investments of the family's wealth. And start thinking of what's the ROI in the various operating companies versus alternatives, things we could be doing with our money. That's how you start to put the plan together.
Sure. Roxanne, advisors. Obviously, we bring together advisors. How? I mean, you work with the longest of the families that we have here. How?
Well, okay, I'm going to qualify that the family office as a private wealth management thing has just been since the 90s. The family in itself has its roots for 900.
Which has been looking after its the multi-generational wealth quite well to set up the family office. But how do you find bringing in advisors, and how in your time there, does the mandate change? I mean, here we have every 6 months they're coming together. Yours, do you have a much longer time frame, or do you?
So this family, I agree entirely with the rest of the panelists about disintermediation, et cetera. So this family specifically actually created, our advisors are actually our external managers per se. We don't really, or legal trust structuring. So we give the bread to the baker. They make decisions as to how much control they want, what is going to be managed internally, what is key to long-term value creation of that wealth, and what is, what we need to buy, or what do we need to build, and what do we want to outsource. So that's really the decision-making process. So for us, we have, innovated internally in the way that we've run risk or hedging strategies by learning from the managers, or, doing primary research on specific themes, or, working with universities on specific projects or other things like that. So for us, I would say I did see the rise of the multifamily office as a result of this kind of disintermediation and this lack of trust that people have with banks because of the conflicts of interest that are inherent in their business model. But I would take that question and give it back to you, since you are running one multifamily office. You can maybe...
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think you have to differentiate between single-family offices, multifamily offices, and then multifamily offices that provide product. And I think that one of the things that I think is interesting is the evolution of the family office that does something very well and then decides to raise external capital. So it's an interesting development. I think that one that if I was the family, if it was more from a single family, that I would be very careful about. I think it's because you don't want to dilute the mandate or the mission. So I think that it's something, I think you have to be of quite a large critical mass before you would start doing that if you're a single family. As a multifamily, for my multifamily I run global asset allocation. So it's a very natural global product for ultra high net worths that are banked poorly within certain private banks. It's never the primary focus, though, of the families that we look after. Within Freedom, the goal is to have 20 significant families that we can advise on slivers. So often they have their own single family office, and we act as a conscience or a barometer by which they can judge their own single family. And we get invited in to offer advice. I think one of the great things is when you're not necessarily just working with one family is that you can spread yourself around and you get to see, almost offer best practice consulting for free in many ways. Simon, you set up the family office for the one client. How has that changed? Has the mandate changed? Do you find your role changes as?
I think before I answer that, I think an area we haven't touched on is actually the innovation in the back office. Lots of family offices, not necessarily in this part of the world yet, but elsewhere, the back office is outsourced to somebody who specializes in settlements and executions and calculations of duration and drawdowns on private equity and things like that. And it's getting cheaper by the day. I've just reviewed ours at 5 basis points per annum, and when we agreed on it, the global custodian said, when we renew it in 2 years' time, he said, I won't be able to charge you anything. It is just a commodity, but you don't need 10 people sitting on a different floor in the building telling you they'll do their valuation, in the next 2 days or whatever. So there's a lot of innovation which you don't really see at the front end. I think going back to your question, it's an ongoing relationship and discussion and review with the family as to what they want and how the world is changing. We touched on it earlier, but family offices have much more time on their side, and yes, we all report monthly or quarterly, and you can have good and bad quarters or whatever. But time is a great healer, and where most family offices have a much higher private equity, private debt exposure, we're only 25% in quoted markets. So we've earned out the volatility, and time is on our side, and we're just waiting for the assets to deliver on what we're expecting.
It's really interesting. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I'd like to touch on the risks and the opportunities that we face, and then I also, to those guys, and then to you, I'd love to know what more you'd like from your family office. So what more can they do for you? So let's start with Roxanne, and we'll work down here. So 30 seconds a minute on the risk opportunities and what you do.
Risk and opportunities in capital markets?
For
that's going to take me a little bit longer than 30.
The evolution of the family office space.
So I think that, when people think about setting up a family office, they need to think long-term. It's costly. It's people management. There are all kinds of issues. And actually, when you take a family office job, it is not often as glamorous as might meet the eye, so to speak. So character is extremely important, which Simon has touched upon, and Carole can speak about this in spades. So I think that if the question is, when you're setting up a family office, what do you have to think about? Well, there are lot of issues to think about. And that's why you do have options of multifamily offices, and private banks have understood that they need to, address this conflict of interest, and there are people that act in good faith, and that's a key thing. Because if you're going to create a family office with a bunch of line items, the complexity of that family office can go out of control. In fact, a lot of these family offices that want very sophisticated, high controlled, smart asset management have hired people that cost millions of dollars, and that's why they're raising external money, like MSD or Pritzker or whatever. These guys are mini investment banks. They're hybrid merchant banks or hybrid private equity firms in their own right. So in that situation, it's about really, do you think they have an alignment of interest or not?
Sure. Simon.
I think it's, I've touched on it before, but it's managing the expectations, particularly of the younger generation. As one or two people in this conference talking about credit markets, there's been a 25-year bull market in fixed interest. It's all coming to an end, and they are going to start seeing single-digit or returns, or possibly a negative year or something like that, which the older members of the family understand and are probably quite sympathetic about. But it's the younger members of the family who have just grown up in a 25-year bull market who just don't know what's going to happen.
Sure. Carole? I know.
I would say that the greatest opportunities are for the families to be the founders of the great innovations that will literally save the planet, and this is the best way to engage the next generation and to move, as Simon says, toward a more virtual family office structure and get the best experts for anything you're doing, and they can all be external and they can all work together as a team. I know many multi-billion-dollar families who have 2 or 3 employees and everybody else is outsourced, so it's very innovative. And the biggest risk is to not keep your eye on risk and to not look at your concentrations, to also not look at the fact that maybe your industry is dying, let's say media, for example, or if you own a publishing company, you're in trouble right now, and to be willing to change. The biggest risk is to not change, actually, as the world changes.
Ruchi, last word.
Yeah, I love the way that you said the barometer.
Yes.
So I would love for my family office people to actually give some feedback to us as well, and that's really important, because oftentimes we feel that they don't really express their viewpoints, right? Because if we give them a mandate, okay, just look at medtech startups, they're forced to look at that, but they should bring up their views in a much more open way.
Tell them.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank all my panel. It's such a wide-ranging subject, and hopefully we've touched on some things that you've enjoyed. Again, thank you very much, panel, and thank you, audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.